Hey everyone, welcome to another episode of the Florida Sound Archive podcast. I'm your host, Jeff Kaiser, and for today's episode, I have on with me a very special guest. He was in the Fuckboyz, otherwise known as the F Boyz, Aesop Dekker. Aesop, welcome in. How are you?
Good, man. Great. Thanks for having me.
It's a pleasure. Glad to finally have you on the podcast to tell your story. And we were just chatting a little bit before the episode about records. Your background looks kind of like mine as well. So, how long have you been collecting records for?
Since I was, probably like 10, I don't know. I think back then I didn't think of it as collecting, we just bought records. Then when I moved from Florida out to California, the Bay Area, I didn't bring a lot of my records with me. It was kind of, and I've actually had periods where I've like had like a Buddhist freak out and sold all my possessions. And so this behind me is probably like the result of, I'd say, the last like 15, 20 years or so of buying records.
Are there any Florida ones that survived and still in the collection?
Oh, plenty. Like, yeah, I had the opportunity, I guess, when I was in my early 20s, I was visiting my mom and I found a box of my records in her garage and I was able to rescue like my original Disorderly Conduct LP and some of my 7 inches, like the We Can't Help It, which I see in your background. So yeah, a few of those things, like the things that I thought like, I would probably never ever see again and were also hugely important to me as a teenager. Like I'm not a nostalgic guy, but I am.
Well, we're going to get a little nostalgic for this episode because we're going to go back
Absolutely.
in time, a trip down memory lane. So I appreciate you sharing a little bit about the records. And let's go back a little bit to your early beginnings. I believe you did grow up in Hollywood, Florida. Is that right?
I did, yeah. So for those who I assume that the lay of Florida is generally known to your listeners, but Hollywood is um like a beach town, retirement community type place. I haven't been there in a long time. But it's right between Fort Lauderdale and Miami. So kind of just so it was a good place to grow up if you're going to grow up in Florida with access to both these cities and scenes there. So yeah, that's where I grew up.
Where'd you go to high school?
I went to MacArthur High School in Hollywood. Yeah. And I think the most famous graduate of MacArthur High School is like an NFL guy named Eric Rett, who I actually did go to high school with and was a super nice guy. So,
There you go. Were there any local bands at the time when you were going to MacArthur?
like at MacArthur,
Right.
yeah, I think there was like some heavy metal bands. But I feel like one was called Vixen, but I don't remember any others. Like there was like, as far as punkers in the early 80s and at MacArthur, I think it was like me and one other dude, who was also in the Fuckboyz. So, I think we were it.
When you were growing up, did your family have any influence on you musically?
No, my family don't really have a musical background. They've always been like artists. My mom's a painter. My grandfather and grandmother were painters and sculptors, and they dabbled. My grandfather was a photographer, and that's how he made his living. So there was always sort of like we were encouraged to be creative, but not necessarily musical. When I was like 10, I wanted to play guitar, and my mom agreed to like get me guitar lessons. And it was from the bass player of the Miami Sound Machine. But I sucked at it. I was terrible. And the guy was really frustrated, and he like told my mom, and I think it was a jab, but I didn't realize it till later. But he was like, told my mom, I think your son is a drummer. And then I was like, oh, well, get me a drum set. And she was like, oh, fuck no. Like, we're not doing that. So, and then a couple of years later, I just fell in with some other kids who were punks in my neighborhood and they did a band and they asked me to like play drums because drummers were hard to come by. So that's how I started playing drums. It was, just self-taught, just here, do this.
How did the connection come about between yourself, your family, and the basis of the Miami Sound Machine?
Oh, he was a like a teacher at like a local, I think it was like a music store and they like gave lessons. And it was like one of these places where it was like they give you lessons, but then there's this high pressure thing to like keep upselling you better and better gear. It's a good racket, like if you have a music store. But this guy ultimately was frustrated because, I wasn't, maybe he was right. I just didn't have the aptitude for it. I wasn't getting any better. I didn't want to play like Mary Had a Little Lamb and Tisket a Tasket. Like I wanted to like, rock AC/DC songs
Nice.
and
I mean,
stuff, and I was 10, so I didn't really
sure.
understand it. Like you got to put into it.
Right,
So,
exactly. So that makes complete sense. So what were you listening to back then, or perhaps you can share some of your early influences in music?
oh, like when I was 10, I mean, everything was like Kiss. I definitely remember that like growing up and listening to music, I was really like myopic. Like you were really loyal to, I felt really loyal to one band, and like Kiss for me was the band until I discovered AC/DC when I was 10, when Back in Black came out. And I was like, oh my God. And then they had all these records that I didn't know about. And then I discovered, Black Sabbath and Led Zeppelin and, stoner kids in my neighborhood when I was like an adolescent, and then I kind of gravitated like towards like I heard Devo and I like lost my shit and I loved the Police and bands like this. And then there was an older guy in my neighborhood named James who like kind of recognized that I was interested in like, just knowing about Devo was kind of a thing. And he turned me on to like the Sex Pistols and the Damned, and the Ramones and these kind of things. And he was the dude that I played in my first band with. He was like basically like grooming me to like become a punk rocker so I could play in the drums in his band. And then from there it was just meeting other kids at shows and being turned on to like more hardcore stuff, Minor Threat and the Bad Brains and whatnot. It just kind of goes from there.
Sure. And I imagine growing up in Hollywood, you were in the backyard of the infamous Hollywood Sportatorium. So did you ever go to any concerts there?
I did. I went to many concerts. I saw Judas Priest at the Sportatorium, and I saw Rat with Poison opening. I saw Ozzy and Metallica at the Sportatorium. I saw Iron Maiden like more than once at the Sportatorium. So yeah, it was a big deal. I walked home from the Sportatorium once in the middle of the night in the rain all the way down Alligator Alley because I got stranded there at that Rat show. So
Wow, what was that experience like for you?
oh, it was like we used to go. Sometimes me and my friends, if we were bored, would like, and we knew about a show at the Sportatorium, we would just go and like not really expecting to get in. We would just do the like parking lot scene and like drink lots of other people's booze and smoke lots of other people's weed. And sometimes we, scrape up enough money to go in, and that was one of those nights. And I ended up getting really, really drunk. And when I left, it was like a rainstorm, and I couldn't find the people I came with. And I just jumped into a car with some other kids, and they were driving me, and we got into a heated debate over the merit of Rat. And I was very opinionated, and I said Rat sucked, and they left me on the side of Alligator Alley where I walked probably, I don't even know how many miles, but in the dark, in the mud, with like trucks racing by you. Ever driven on that road, it's fucking terrifying.
Oh yeah. I gotten
So
stuck on that road before and
yeah,
yeah,
horrible. So I mean, imagine walking down it in a rainstorm. So
that's wild.
yeah, yeah. So definitely some times at the Sportatorium.
Were there any other venues, whether they were larger or smaller, that you were also going to around the same time?
Oh yeah, like I was like a frequent kid at the Cameo Theater. I think the Cameo started having shows. I think I was like in the ninth grade, like 14 years old, 15 around there. And I was going to all those shows. I tried to go to Flynn's a couple times when I was really young, and that place I think was 18 and up, and I couldn't get into Flynn's, and I would try. And bless Richard Shelter. I hope he's watching this because he was so patient and cool with me. And then And then I think they started having matinee shows on like Sundays, and I could see like, usually like four or five really great local bands, so yeah, Flynn's, the Cameo, there was some shows at the Lincoln, the Fireman's Hall in Fort Lauderdale. I saw Husker Du there, I saw Black Flag there. And then the earliest days of Churchill's, like Churchill's kind of came about right as I was on my way out, but definitely played some early shows there and attended some. So
Were there any local bands that caught your attention back then? We were going to some of those other shows.
oh, tons. I mean, Broken Talent I will always sing their praises because they were sort of like, for me, like they were like mentors, like when we were started playing in bands, they kind of were the dudes that were really welcoming, got us on some shows and showed us the ropes, and I was just in awe of them just because they were they were like hippies, they had long hair and they had beards, and everyone fucking hated, like punks hated them, like, and I was really big on Flipper. So I've always said that like Broken Talent were kind of like Florida's Flipper, plus they had like really great songs, and they just didn't give a fuck, and they were huge influence. um the Disorderly Conduct and F from Melbourne, when they would come through, I would try to, they were favorites. I think that F's You Are an EP is probably the best Florida punk record of all time. Sector 4 from Tallahassee, one of my favorite bands. I'm like been seeking that, trying to get that 7-inch as far as record collecting goes, and
Right.
waiting to see one for less than a few $100s. Um, Hated Youth, Morbid Opera, much like Broken Talent, were people that were really friendly to me and raised me up as a little kid. Lisa and Libby used to drive me. They lived in Fort Lauderdale, so they would like have to pass through Hollywood to go to shows at the Cameo, and they would sometimes offer me a ride. I think at one point, like my mom insisted on meeting them, and so it was cool. Like in that I know it's like kind of a cliche, but like a lot of, for me and a lot of people, one of the things that made me gravitate towards punk was like those kind of interactions, that like people who were, idols to me and were heroes, would interact with me and talk to me and give me a ride to a show, and and lend me a couple bucks, and so that to me it's just super magical, and that's something that I think has been a red thread through my whole existence, is this idea that like, you community and kindness are important,
Right. And because you were checking out so much of these different shows, did you ever have an experience where maybe it didn't go that way, where someone was not as kind to you and perhaps did not accept you?
I mean, one-off things, like there were times where like bands I was in were opening for bands and they weren't particularly friendly, the Bad Brains. And you know, but for the most part, no, like I always felt welcomed and accepted, and there was, yeah, I just, yeah, a lot of old, and I was particularly young. Like I started going to punk shows. I was like 13, and when I was 13, I looked 10, because I'm not a big dude, and so a lot of the older people in the scene like looked out for me, and you know, I have memories of people like monitoring my drinking and making sure I was okay, and holding my hair while I was throwing up, and you know and these were like people that were all in these bands that were, massive to me. So very grateful for that.
Right. Yeah, that's good to hear that it was mostly a positive experience for you. And at what point did you know you wanted to be a part of your own band?
I don't, it's weird. Like I said, it had never occurred to me until James, who my first band was called SLA with him. And, he was the one who was like, "Oh, I have this band," which was really just him and a bass player, and he urged me to like play drums. And he even like went out and bought like the cheapest, shittiest drum set he could find and set it up in his garage. And I just went over there a couple times a week and, you know, just played the simple 4/4 beat that I'd learned from watching other bands play, you know. That's the reason why like drums to me worked, because I could visually see and ape that. You can't really like, you know, you see a chord, you don't really know what's going on, you know. So drums to me was just very like, oh, I copy these body movements. And so I started playing with them just out of like, you know, but it wasn't my idea. It was something I was sort of like coerced into doing and just, you know, continued to do because it was fun. And unlike when I took guitar lessons from the guy in Miami Sound Machine, like I saw marked improvement. Like every time I would sit down behind the drum set, I was getting better and I was learning. So then I became excited about it, you know, and then I don't think at that point I thought, oh, this is going to be my life and this is going to be the next, you know, 40 fucking years, you know, but here we are.
It flies by. Did SLA ever play any shows?
Played like a few. I think we played once at the Brockway Theater, which is on the University of Miami campus. I think something that Broken Talent had set up. They were doing shows there. Played like a house party in Fort Lauderdale. But other than that, like at our singer's house, but other than that, I don't really know. We recorded two songs. I think at eSync or Criterion. My memory is terrible. And they were on a comp that Malcolm from Broken Talent put out called Florida versus the rest of the world. Which is like I think he ran off like 100 copies of it. Um,
Wow.
and that was about as far as that band went. And then we changed the lineup a little bit, and the name changed to White Riot. And I think White Riot played maybe even less shows than SLA did. And then out of White Riot, Scott and Matt, who were the singer and bass player of White Riot, that's the guys I started the Fuckboyz with. So kind of started as a side project of White Riot, and then we decided we were more interested in doing that, and we kind of had a falling out with James and whatnot. So you know, as you do when you're teenagers.
Exactly. So when you were forming the F Boys, the Fuck Boys, talk about that early period. What was that like getting together and figuring out what you want to do with that band?
Well, I mean, one of the things that I think was like when Matt and Scott joined White Riot, they were James's friends. I didn't really know them, you know. And once I met them, they were like a little closer to my age, and we had a lot of the same interests, you know, like liked a lot of the same bands. We listened to like more hardcore stuff than James was interested in. He was very much into this like 77 style, like the Clash and the Damned and whatnot. And you know, our interests were elsewhere. We wanted to do something that was less serious, you know. We were kind of like liked a lot of, I guess, what people called funny punk, like Adrenaline OD were huge to us, and like the Meatmen and stuff like that. And we wanted to wear stupid clothes and, you know, have songs that were fun and funny, you know. So we started doing that. And plus the other thing was Maddie, who he was the singer of White Riot, but like we found out that he was like a pretty good guitar player, you know. And we had asked James, you know, hey, we should have two guitars, and James wasn't interested in it. So Matty wanted to do a band where he played guitar. So it was me, and then Matty on guitar, and his brother Scott on bass, and then the only other punker kid I knew at MacArthur, Seaweed, became our singer. You know, and it was like still to this day of all the, you know, bands I've been in, I will always say that Seaweed was probably one of the most capable and good and like, you know, fidelitous, just real good singers that ever was, you know, that I ever got to play with. So
What did he do before he became a member of the F Boys?
nothing, you know. He was a neighborhood kid that I knew that was like me, was kind of dabbling in punk, and we kind of groomed him a little bit, you know. Oh, here, listen to this, listen to that. And he was like, got super excited about it, you know. But he was like, you know, in my high school, he was like a wrestler, you know, and he was like kind of a regular kid, but he had some pretty interesting musical. He was open, you know. He had a willingness and an open-mindedness to it. Plus, he was a really great singer, and he was a big dude, and he was funny. So that's the kind of that's who you want fronting your punk band, you know. a big guy that's funny,
Right.
you know? So yeah, and then we were super excited and we went to work, we just like wrote songs and recorded a demo, um, which is like what became the 7-inch that was put out on Destroy, So we but then, I graduated high school and went to college. So, and that, college fucked up more punk bands than anything else. So I went to college and I moved out to San Francisco, and those guys continued for like a year with a different drummer, with George Gracatana, who was in a bunch of great bands, Jobbernall, and really great drummer, way better than I was at that time. And that's when they started playing, like they were getting asked to play every show at the Cameo, and they were recording more. So like they kind of became more of a real band at that point. Like when the first year I was in the band, we didn't know what the fuck we were doing. Played some shows at the Churchills and whatnot. Our very first show was at like a McGruff the Crime Dog block party, So
How'd you get booked for that?
I don't even know. I think it was in Maddie and Scott's neighborhood. And like I think maybe their parents or something had something to do with organizing it. So we played. Our second show was at a Special Olympics at Scott's high school. So I right off the bat, I was like, well, this is great. Like this is way cooler than playing punk shows.
Were there any other local bands you can remember who you shared some of those bills with?
Yeah, we played some shows with the Spooky Kids, who obviously went on to become Marilyn Manson. The Roids, who I see were like a band we played a lot of shows with. Um, Quit from Miami became fast friends and played a lot of shows with them. Yeah, I think by the time we were playing, I think Broken Talent was pretty much over. I think Morbid Opera was done at that point. But, mainly like Quit and we're like the band that we kind of, that happens with bands. Like you find a band that you're on the same plane with, you know. And they had a whole life. Like for the first year I was living in San Francisco, like they were connecting with all these other people that I never met or knew. And then they moved out to San Francisco in 89. And George ended up moving back to Miami after the 1989 earthquake. And then I was asked to rejoin the band, and it existed for another 3 years after that.
Did people know that the origins of the band were from South Florida?
I mean, no, when we first moved out here, when like we all ended up out here, the only people that we were really tight with out here was another band from Florida, Stevie Stiletto and the Switchblades, who were amazing. And they were like slightly older dudes, played lots of shows with them out here, but like them, we weren't taken seriously. I know that's weird to say after I was just like, well, we wore stupid clothes and had dumb props but like, like we couldn't get shows at the cool bars at like the scene was pretty much locked in with like these same 4 or 5 bands. And it was a little like disappointing because San Francisco for us was like this massively inspiring place, and there was all these things happening, and we were kind of cut out of it. It felt like we were cut out of it. I don't know if it was because we were just like seen as like hicks from Florida or just younger guys or just, but we weren't really welcomed into the scene other than the Stevie Stiletto guys who were in the same situation as us.
Right. Now, Stevie Stiletto was from Jacksonville, if I'm not
Yeah.
mistaken. So, when you were still in Florida, were you going outside of South Florida to some other parts of the state, whether it be Orlando, Tampa, Jacksonville, that sort of thing, to check out some other shows?
No, I mean, I went to Tampa once to go see, it was Destruction, like the German thrash band, and the Cro-Mags. And me and some friends drove. up to Tampa to see it, and there was a stabbing at the show, like before we even got there. So we got there, and it was like totally. And I think that was our one attempt. And none of the bands I played in there ever traveled. I actually the Fuckboyz did, but it was when I wasn't in the band. I think they went as far as like Atlanta with the Descendants or something. But no. But I did have, with my parents being divorced, my dad, lived in San Francisco. So summers I got to go to San Francisco, and I caught some shows out here, and I'd get to go to cool record stores, and it's kind of how I ended up here because I knew that this was like an area, a city I loved. So
Right. Yeah. And you think about some of the record stores that you grew up with in the Hollywood area, just in South Florida in general. Were there any that you would check out back in that time?
oh yeah, I mean, open books and records in Miami were a huge lifesaver. And in Fort Lauderdale, there was like a punk specialty store called Underground, ran by this guy, Mark Underground. And it was a really small store with very few things. But he, again, I'm like, I'm thinking back to these people that were older than me, and how kind and patient they were with me because, I have memories of going to open books and records and like literally like counting out pennies, on the fucking counter. And at Underground, like he had a lot of like cool import stuff, like British and international punk stuff. I couldn't afford any of it, and he would like let me show up with blank cassettes and make tapes of records. And it wasn't making him any money, and he didn't care. He'd let us skip school and hang out there and tape all of his inventory. And so I'm just really like, I get choked up because I just think about how kind and patient these people were, because I was fucking annoying as shit, like just pushy and entitled and loud, and they were really good to me. So yeah, those two stores in particular. In Hollywood, there was like a place called Vibrations that was like a head shop, and they had like a small record section, and they had like what they called the imports section. And I bought a lot of punk records there and metal records. Definitely remember buying like Misfits, Earth AD there, and Voivod records. And it was pre-internet, so we were buying these things sight unseen, like, oh, and just vibing off the cover or the song titles, or and that's how it was. But I mean, to go to open books and records, it was like 3 hours on a bus. It was like several buses, and I did it. Now I won't, like,
That's a
it's hard
trek,
to,
man.
yeah, it's like, I don't go around the corner to get like a slice of pizza or something.
Times
But
change.
but back when I was like 14, it was a mission.
Sure,
you
absolutely. And there were a lot of really good chain places too, like Peaches and Camelot and Specs.
Yeah.
Were you going to shops like that too? Maybe like in your local mall?
Yeah, there was like I think a warehouse or one of those big chains at the 163rd Street Mall in North Miami. And I would go there, and I had a crush on the girl who worked behind the counter, and she was a punker. And also like remember going to those kind of places, and they would have these sections. It would be like punk and new wave all mixed in. So every once in a while you'd like buy a record that you thought would be a punk record, and it wouldn't be a punk record, but sometimes it was great. Like bought the first Smiths album like that. It was like, oh, this looks punk. Like it's got a black and white picture of a shirtless dude, really demonstrating the intersectionality between hardcore and homoeroticism. And I bought that record, and I took it home, and it didn't sound anything like I thought it would, but it became like a record that I listened to immensely and still listen to this day. Bought the first Public Enemy record thinking it was a punk record, because it had like things about the government.
Right. I could see
You
that.
know?
Yeah, I could see that. And also, think about we're talking about the record stores. What about radio? Did you ever find any good
Oh,
radio growing up down in South Florida?
yeah. So it's weird. I feel like you're like I'm just saying these things that like everybody who watches this is like, oh yeah, like, but on Miami's NPR affiliate WLRN in the 80s, the early 80s, I guess all through the 80s. There was a show called Off the Beaten Path, which was hosted by a guy named Bob Slade. And this show, life changer. And it was like, it started, I think, like Sunday at midnight. So I remembered, I would take one of those 2 hour, it was a 2 hour show, those 2 hour like Maxell cassettes, and I'd put one in and I would record the show, and I'd usually doze off before it was over. And the popping of the tape and the side ending would jolt me awake, and I'd quickly flip it over and record the other side. And then I had a Walkman and I would listen to it over the next week till the next show. And I would take these extensive notes because he would play like 10 or 15 songs and then he would tell you what they were. And I remember being in detention in high school and like having the notebook and the cassette and like highlighting, writing down all the songs. And then this one was cool, this one sucked, oh my, and then I would cross reference with like Maximum Rock and Roll, and I would look and I would read about the bands, and sometimes you would see their address, and then right there in detention I would fire off my letters, which were always like, I live in a horrible place, the cops are mean, I like skateboarding, please send me a sticker, and and shit would come in the mail, records would show up in the mail and stickers and letters from other bands. And going back to what I said, I was like fucking mind blown that I could, and I was like communicating sometimes with people that were in like Germany and France. And my mom was completely puzzled by this, like why I was getting mail from people in Japan, at 16 years old. So
Right.
this was just my quest. So yes, but again, hails to Bob Slade and WLRN, Off the Beaten Path. Just hundreds and hundreds of bands brought to my attention just through that alone.
It has come up many times with a lot of guests because that's how much of a reach it had. It influenced almost everybody. So, which is pretty amazing, especially for back in that time period where a lot of it was just word of mouth or you just discovering it on the radio or something to that effect. You mentioned Maximum Rock and Roll as a zine. Were there any zines locally that you remember checking out?
Yeah, absolutely. The only one that I remember that was really highly, highly influential was called Tropical Depression. And I think they only eked out like maybe 4 issues. Um, and it wasn't very, there wasn't a whole lot of content, but it was, and I'm trying to, I have a couple issues somewhere here that I only came about like maybe 10 years ago. There used to be a zine store in San Francisco, and I brought in a stack of zines to trade and found a couple issues of Tropical Depression, and just like looking at the pages just took me back. But it was a woman who did it. She was great, and a lot of the drawings in it. There were a lot of drawings by Eddie Nothing, who was in the Gay Cowboys and F, and I loved his art. He was like kind of like South Florida's like Raymond Pettibone or something, and drew all their stuff. And just mostly reading about shows I'd been to and reading interviews and record reviews. And I remember it being like kind of like a weird goal, like to be written about in Tropical Depression. But by the time I was playing in bands, I think it was done. I think, yeah, 3 or 4 issues.
You mentioned there was a woman who did Tropical
Yeah.
Depression. Was that uncommon back then for women to be doing zines down in South Florida and just the involvement in the scene at that point?
It's weird. I think about this a lot because when I look back on like how like punk and hardcore worked in these scenes, and for all the like, oh, we were, really progressive or whatever, it still, was this white male dominated thing, and but women sort of became like the documentarians, and this is not just in South Florida. This is like everywhere, and you're seeing it now because like films are being made and books are being written about individual punk scenes. And you almost always see that it was like the women who were doing the writing and the photographing and, and the dudes were, playing in the bands, and it's dumb, but I love that there was people to do that, to make sure that this stuff was preserved, because we weren't thinking in those terms. Kids don't think like that, especially if you're like a young punker kid in the 80s and we're going to die in a nuclear war growing up, mutually assured destruction. Like, it was really hard for any of us to think beyond today, so I'm really glad that that happened. But, for me, personally, like Morbid Opera, who I've mentioned, and they were women, and they owned a store in like Wilton Manors where they sold like some records and vintage clothes. And to me, they were heroes. They were still one of my favorite bands. I think they're one of the few Florida bands from that time when I still listen to them, it holds up, like it occurred to me, I listened to them recently and I was like, man, if this band existed now, they'd be like, these kind of like indie darlings, and they'd be playing like Coachella or something, but so I kind of feel really fortunate that like there were strong female role models in the scene, but yeah, I think that a lot of the documentation was relegated to women for that reason, because as musicians, they weren't taken seriously, sadly enough.
Right. And the name slipped my mind when we're getting into it, but Tony Latino is who put out Tropical Depression. She put out that zine.
That is correct. Wow, good on you.
So, and that's important because to create that diversity in the scene. What about when you were going to some of the shows? Considering some of those pits could get a little violent and crazy. Do you remember a lot of women also partaking in some of that activity as well back then?
I mean, I feel like especially when I was going to lots of shows at the Cameo, like I would say that like the female to male ratio at those shows was probably like 15 to 1, you know, like definitely not like now. Like you go to shows now and it's a very different thing, but that was what I remember. Um, I wasn't like a big pit dude, you know. I was a more of like in the balcony smoking weed kid, But yeah, like there were, I knew a few women in the scene, and again, like I said, they were the ones who were like taking the photos and making the zines, and at record stores and doing things, and managing bands or booking shows and whatnot in this more organizational capacity. But yeah, it was very, very few women, if I remember correctly. I mean, I always joke about it because, like, dudes like my age when we were like 15 and 16 like lamented because there were no, like, the girls we hung out with were like into new wave, like Echo and the Bunnymen and the Cure, which I love those bands, but back then I wouldn't freely admit it, you know. And I always tell this story. There was a short-lived venue in Hollywood called The Cell. And I remembered that there was a girl I liked who I had met at the Cameo Theater. And, we were talking on the phone and she was like, "Oh, I'm going to see Echo and the Bunnymen at The Cell. Like, you should go." And I was like, "I can't go." And then I ended up going, but I remember being really like nervous that I would see like dudes I knew from the punk scene there, and they'd be like, if anybody sees me, like, why am I at this Echo and the Bunnymen show? And I got to that show, and there was a bunch of people I knew there because they were doing the same exact thing I was. They were there because they liked some girl. And it was like, it was now Echo and the Bunnymen, like one of my favorite bands.
Right.
But at the time I was, that's how we are when we're young. We're very hung up on that kind of shit.
Totally. I can empathize with that story because I was there myself and not at that show, but I was there with some other bands and it just part of growing up, I guess.
Yeah. Yeah. So lack of women in the punk scene for sure, and again, I think like if I go to shows now, which I don't do very often, but like I'm always fascinated by that, right? You know, and I think that's, because certain attitudes have changed. Like, but I think when I was younger, I was just like, oh, women just don't like punk, you know? And I don't think it was that at all. Like I've come to this conclusion that it's like, oh, we kind of did create an unwelcoming environment. Like I felt, like I said earlier, like I felt welcome in this community and shit, but I'm also, like ultimately a white dude, So I think it was harder for women or for people who were black or Latino, that just to be participants in it. There was always a stigma, not a stigma, that's not the right word, but like a unspoken bias, you know.
And you having been to so many shows down in South Florida, when you think back in your Rolodex of shows, what was the most dangerous one you can remember going to?
Oh man, I went to this show. Uh Nightmare scenario. It was at the Cameo. It was the last show I ever went to in Florida. And if I remember correctly, and again, my memory is bad. And also I should point out that when I was like 16 years old, I took a lot of LSD. And I was on a lot of LSD at a lot of these shows. But there was a show in particular at the Cameo. Uh, I'm gonna say this is like June or July of 1988, and it was the Vandals, Doctor No, and the Mentors were supposed to play but canceled, and like three or four locals. But like leading up to that time, and this is where I might be hazy, there was like this problem, like Tampa had a large like Nazi skinhead scene, and South Florida had skinheads, but they didn't really seem to have like a political agenda. They were just dicks, that wanted to beat people up. They were equal opportunity beater uppers, you know. And I'd had run-ins with them over the years, and everybody did. It was like a rite of passage, like, um, they just pick somebody seemingly at random to beat up on. And I got it one night at the Lords and New Church show at the Cameo. Still wasn't the most dangerous or shitty experience I'd had, but by the time that Vandal show had happened, like, I was like a guy who was in some bands that people liked, and most of the skinheads knew me and were just either friendly, I don't want to say friendly, indifferent or civil. And there was an incident where Tampa had like a bunch of Nazi skinheads, and I guess, they'd run them out of the scene. And a couple of those guys had ended up coming down to Miami. And there was some incident, I think, where a homeless man was murdered, and it was rumored to be skinheads. And there was this beef that sort of surfaced between racist and non-racist skinheads, that was like culminating in this show. And I vaguely remember being at the show really high on LSD, and one of the skinheads coming in explaining to me that there was like gonna be this massive brawl at this show, and like handing me like a shitty plastic box cutter, and gets tucked in my shirt, and I'd forget all about it. And when the Vandals came on, the air conditioning broke in the Cameo. So imagine June in Florida in a disgusting old theater. I mean, it was brutally fucking hot. And I remember noticing that there were a lot of people there that I'd never seen at shows before, like bikers and redneck dudes. And it just, there's a vibe, there was a real pall over the whole show. And when the Vandals played, like the whole place just erupted in violence. And I remembered like going up to the like hiding out, going to the balcony to like cower, and there's people fighting in the balcony, and going into the bathroom and there's people fighting in the bathroom, and just having this moment where I was like, I gotta find my people and get the fuck out of here. This is really bad. And one of those like LSD, like hyper clear visuals. I just remembered this big redneck dude with a cast on, and just as people were trying to leave the main hall, just grabbing them and bashing people in the face with this cast. And I like ducked under him. And I remember as I ran through that long lobby and got to the box office, the guy in the box office like hits the intercom and goes, "No ins or outs," and I was like, fuck, man. Like, and I remember like in the car ride home with my friends just being like, I don't want to be here anymore. I hate Florida. I hate this fucking scene. I hate this place. And I had been on the fence about where I was going to go to school and where I was going to live. And that for me was just like this defining, like, this place is fucking over, you know. It was brutal. It was my Altamont. They always like Altamont was the end of the 60s.
Right.
That fucking show was my fucking Altamont. It was like, I'm out. I can't be here, you know.
Wow. Have you at all reminisced about that show with other people over the years? Did you all kind of have the same story and recollection of that show?
I don't know that I've ever talked to anybody who was at that night, other than Maddie, who was the guitar player of the Fuckboyz and Hickey, who was definitely there with me. But I don't know that we ever like really tried to like sit down and dissect like what the fuck happened. Like we were both really high on LSD. I might have just hallucinated the whole thing. I don't know. Maybe if there's somebody out there that was at that show, like
There will be. There
I would
definitely
really
will be.
love to hear their recollection because it was fucked. It was just like I had never seen ultra violence like that in my fucking lifetime. So yeah.
Sounds crazy.
Yeah, and I mean I've read like all you read all the like the Black Flag related books and bands, and they always talk about playing in South Florida was like the worst and the most violent and the most fucked up. And I think there's also like this tough guy thing of basically like thinking or saying your scene was the most fucked up and the most violent. By and large, I saw fights every time I went to the Cameo Theater and they were just part of it. I didn't think too much about it. Fights and punk shows, they kind of went hand in hand. This was like some next level shit. It stayed with me for sure.
Yeah. What were the cops like back then, considering that this was in many ways a little new territory? Some of these fights going on at shows. What do you remember about law enforcement back then?
I mean, I definitely remember like when I was leaving that show and I remember there were like riot cops like marching down fucking Collins Avenue, and it reminded me of like pictures I'd seen like of shows in LA, like Black Flag shows. But cops are dicks. They still are, right? They were like always, I don't know that it was particularly better or worse in Florida. I mean, our experiences were, you'd have shows and cops would break them up and you'd move the show and then cops would come and break it up and you worked around them and you did the thing. But yeah, I mean, I definitely like in Hollywood, like in my neighborhood, I had run-ins with the same 4 or 5 dickhead cops, when I was a teenager and whatnot. And also like going back like years later, um, to spend time with friends and seeing like a couple of the worst dudes I went to high school with became cops. I just it's like it's just they're like they have this weird symbiotic relationship with punk, but I don't think it was like LA or like if you were in LA or New York where you had these scenes that were highly visible, then it was more of a thing. I don't know that the punk scene was even that much on the radar for like the cops in South Florida, or they gave a shit that much, other than look at these ugly kids, let's fuck with them,
Right.
you know. But, I mean, in LA, like, definitely spent a lot of time thinking about this. And I've read a lot of books and heard accounts. It was like LA, like, put its full weight against punk. Like it's weird to think that it's like this fucking entertainment capital, but like at the time, punk was such a threat that they were like throwing cops at it. Pete Wilson, who was the mayor of San Diego, and then later became the governor of California. Like, big part of his platform was he was going to ban punk from San Diego city limits, like make punk illegal. Like, I don't even know how the fuck you do that, but this was a campaign promise, right? So they were throwing their full shit at it, but I just felt like in Florida, nah, it wasn't. I mean, we just accepted it, much like the violence, I guess.
Right. And what about at the F Boy shows? Was there a lot of violence at your shows, or did any situations arise with the police officers, anything like that in your memory?
I don't really recall any specific incidents. There was a show when SLA was playing at the Brockway Theater where like we upset some skinheads and they fucking sprayed a fire extinguisher at us. I mean, like, and but I don't, we didn't. No, I think also after I left the band, or even when I was in the band, the Fuckboyz weren't, we weren't like this tough hardcore band. We were like this kind of rock band with dumb costumes and songs about vampires and shit, So we weren't really attracting like meatheads or skinheads. They weren't. That wasn't really our scene. I wish I had an exciting story to tell you, but for the most part, no, you know.
I mean, that's good in a way that you had a reprieve when you were in your
Yeah.
own band outside of going to some of those shows. And because South Florida was one of those destinations that a lot of punk bands didn't always get to because of how far it was, were there any bands who just you never had the chance to see back then because of
Oh
how,
yeah.
who comes to mind?
Oh, tons. I mean, I don't know about which ones toured, but I feel really lucky that I got to see the Bad Brains many times and Black Flag, the bands that would do it. I guess bands that wouldn't do it were, I never saw Minor Threat. The Misfits came and played in Miami, but I was way too young to get into that show. They played at a place called Finders, and I think I'd probably known about the Misfits for about 6 hours or something, when they came through. Tons of bands, lots of great bands that I love from California that would never come through. Lots of, and then there were bands that we thought we'd never see. We never thought we'd see the Dead Kennedys, and then the Dead Kennedys came and played at the fucking Cameo. So it's weird. It's like it's harder for me to think of bands. I mean, I could name a million bands, great punk bands that I never saw, but my reverence was towards the ones that I did get to see. One of the earliest shows I saw at the Cameo was D. who to this day I think are the best American hardcore band that ever was, and for me that was this crazy religious experience because again, like I said, I was really little and I was up front. I didn't know the etiquette of punk shows at that time, and I was like, leaned against the stage and somebody stage dived and jumped on me and like knocked me out cold. And when I woke up, I was like, I'd been pulled to the side of the stage and they were like telling me like I should go home. And I was like, no, fuck no. Like, and then afterwards I went around the side of the Cameo and D. were loading their van and I thanked them for coming here, which was like my mantra when these bands would come and I'd get to meet them. I'd be like, thank you so much. Bands don't fucking come here because it sucks and cops are dicks and we're not allowed to skateboard and all this shit, but like they remembered me as like the kid that got knocked out and like gave me a t-shirt and I still fucking have it to this day, and then years and years later I was on tour with another band and one of those guys was at our show in Milwaukee and we got talking and I got to tell him, as an adult, like this is, you provided me with this experience that turned out in the grand scheme of things to be very, very influential and life changing, Um, so yeah, lots of bands I didn't get to see and lots I did, the ones that left the mark were like again seeing Black Flag in 84 and 85, like seeing the Bad Brains numerous times, getting to see GBH, getting to see uh Dr. No at that time was one of my favorite things at that terrifying show, man. Like their performance, this is when they were like a three piece and they were like wearing serapes and looked like bad guys from fucking a spaghetti western, and so that was the other thing that was really happening too with going to shows, was not just seeing people, great players play their instrument, which helped me along the way, because I'm a self-taught guy. Everything is visual. But like seeing just getting all these ideas like aesthetically and like, just vibes, being really into just I was really into that. It wasn't just about sonic sound to me. It was about how things looked and how things were presented.
You mentioned skateboarding earlier. Were you big into that too? That's
I was never very good. Again wasn't disciplined enough to get good at it, or even like, I mean, I think adventurous enough to get good at it. Like I was still, if you want to be good at skateboarding, you got to be cool with getting hurt. And I don't know that I ever had that ability to turn that off. And then one of the guys I was playing in one of my first bands with was like, put the fear in me. He was like, "Oh, one of these days you're gonna break your arm and you're not gonna be able to play drums for like a couple months." And that thought at that time terrified me. Now I can go months without playing drums. That's great. But like when I was like 14 and 15. So I kind of made a weird conscious choice between playing drums and skateboarding. I wasn't very good at skateboarding. I wasn't getting better at it because I didn't have that risk-taking gene that you need to have, I mean, I think about that. Like, it's like I see kids like, it's very easy for people my age to be like, fucking kids, but it's the kids that I see that are skateboarding that honestly have the best grasp on how life works, like you get hurt, you keep going, you get hurt, you keep going, like I think those kids are learning this very, very crucial, important life lesson at that age. And I terrified of being hurt. So I skated, I dabbled, I didn't ever get good at it. You know,
Was there a
I
skate park around back then that you
Oh,
remember?
hell no. No, we went to like downtown Fort Lauderdale, or we went to downtown Miami. There was like a drainage ditch on the side of I-95 in Hollywood. We would like hide a broom in the bushes so we could like sweep it out and skate in it, but that was it. And by the time I had a car, like I was less and less interested in it. So most of my skating was done in the like 2 mile radius around where I grew up in Hollywood, you know.
I imagine also because you were skating in these locations that may not have been open to skateboarding, were the cops ever involved with that as well?
Yeah, yeah. You'd meet cops, you'd meet security guards. They'd take your skateboard sometimes. One time I was at Hollywood Beach and I got like, and it was nighttime, and these two cops handcuffed me to the door of their car and told me they were going to wait till they got off work and beat the fuck out of me, and chased all my friends away. And I sat there for about 15, 20 minutes, fucking completely terrified and bracing myself for what I thought was going to be the fucking ass beating of my life, and then they fucking whacked me once behind the knees with a nightstick and let me fucking go, you know. So yeah, I think if you're a teenager and you do anything, you meet cops, you know. Yeah, especially if you live in a small shitty town, like those fucking guys. They don't like you, you don't like them. Just like that Black Flag song, you know.
That's a pretty terrifying experience.
It
It's
was terrifying. I mean, I did not know what was going to fucking happen. And,
right.
it's not wasted on me that like there are people that are way more terrorized than I've ever been, in that situation. But for me, yeah, it was a moment for sure. And this is all the kind of shit that happens to you when you're a teenager that makes you go like, fuck my hometown, fuck this place, and you don't write like a nostalgic John Cougar Mellencamp song about old fucking Mr. Timmons who works at the grocery. You've learned to hate that fucking place, and then you leave. You fucking leave. Get the fuck out of there.
And after you went out west, right? You went out for school, for college, but then you stayed in California. Did you ever return back to Florida to visit in the years that came after?
I've been a few times like on tour with different bands. Hickey, which was the band after the Fuckboyz, we played Churchill's a couple times. The band Agalloch I was in from 2007 till 2015, played Tampa a few times. But when I moved out here, uh, my grandfather passed away there, and then my mother moved to Tucson, Arizona. And most of the people that I cared about and stayed in touch with and truly loved, like ended up other places anyways, you know, um, some in California, some in North Carolina and Georgia and whatnot. But, that's like when we were kids, like, the Mecca for us culturally was Atlanta. Like we all talked about going to Atlanta. Like that was the place where it was happening. But yeah, no, I haven't really visited. My kid who is 23 is really, really like wants to see where I grew up and like wants us to go on a trip together and go see Hollywood, which is really sweet that he's that interested in where I grew up, but I don't care one way or the other. It might even be like shocking.
Well, there are definitely parts of Hollywood that have changed, of course, like all South Florida and a lot of
Right.
places, right? So, but there are a lot of things that still do look like, the 80s and 90s Hollywood.
Yeah, I mean, there are definitely some concrete things that I really miss about South Florida and growing up there and what um you know uh fuck man, like Cuban coffee, and swimming in the Atlantic, and not having a bunch of fucking clothes. Like, just things like this, and also just sort of it's like I if you watch things like I get this thing, and if I watch things that are like set in South Florida, like Dexter, or Bloodline, and like I'm always just reminded about this certain quality of light that exists in Florida that's unlike anywhere else, or the way the sky looks, especially like before a storm, and I'm very nostalgic for those things. But also, I think as we get older, like we don't really we learn, the things that were good become these monumentally great things, and then the things that were bad, you kind of tune out, which is good. I guess that's like a mechanism, a coping mechanism or something. But yeah, I mean, kind of no real desire to return. I wonder if
There, ooh,
I hope that doesn't offend anybody.
was there any life lesson that you took away from growing up down in South Florida that you still carry with you in your present day life?
I don't know, how much of it has to do with growing up in Florida or growing up in the time that I grew up in. I think that definitely at an early age, like I said before, like I learned the importance of a community, and I learned, I don't know, there's also something I think inherent. Like I have a coworker who is from Hollywood as well. I think I told you about that on the phone. Like we discovered, there's a certain sort of like funny cynicism, I think, that comes from being from Florida, like knowing that you're from this place that is kind of a laughing stock or is kind of just real bizarre to other people. So there's kind of like this, yeah, this sort of sense of humor, I think, that comes with me. It's also like, from people from the East Coast. It's the same thing. Honestly, when I look back though, I kind of think about one of the things I think about is how like the neighborhood I grew up in, which was in West Hollywood, which was really like blue collar kind of redneck, in the 70s and 80s. It was a lot of like dudes that were like roofers or lawn care dudes. And like I had good relationships with them. They didn't care that I had like, that I was a weird fucking punker kid and that sometimes had blue hair and whatnot. There was just sort of like, and I think that's probably a thing anywhere, I don't know. I don't know that that's particularly attributed to there, but I think that gave me sort of helped me eliminate or like not go through life with biases that there are people, if someone doesn't really look like me, that they're not, I don't have anything in common with them. I think as I got older, I kind of lost that a little bit and started to sort of, like bitterness and shit filtered in. And over the last few years or whatever, it's sort of, I'm trying to like kind of come back to a lot of that and just remember, and it's going to sound like a cliche, but like, especially with all the divisiveness in this nation right now, but it's like, I just have to remember that, and something I learned there was, people are inherently the same, so I think that, and also, I mean, working hard, I guess, because I didn't grow up in a punk scene like LA or New York or whatnot. I remember I was watching, there's that documentary American Hardcore, and one of the guys in the Zero Boys says that those places, had a river going by them and we had to dig the well. And he's talking about Ohio, I think, where they were from, but I definitely, it wasn't something I thought about at the time, but like that we had such a cool thing and a fucking so separate from, these cultural hubs is still fascinating to me, really amazing to me. And when I listen to like the bands, like there were a lot of bands that were generic and were like, oh, these guys want to be the Exploited or whatever. But a lot of the bands, the ones that I still am enamored with really, really kind of forged their own thing, and like I love that. I was thinking about it because I just recently got the 10-inch reissue of We Can't Help It, We're from Florida, which is great, by the way.
Right. Yes.
And but it's like I was thinking about how the title, like We Can't Help It If We're from Florida, it's kind of like almost this weird apology to the like rest. It's a caveat to the rest of the country or the world about our punk scene. Like it speaks in, it has these two levels. Like in one, it's like, you know, fuck it, we were born here. This is where we're from. Like that's not our fault, but it also is like kind of just demonstrating this thing that like we're operating at a fault, we're like working with less. So that to me, I don't know. And, people who lived in other places where there wasn't, like my favorite hardcore from of the era is from the Midwest, and these places that weren't LA or New York. So,
But to think you brought up American hardcore, I remember in that documentary, Florida wasn't mentioned once, and
yeah, I think it gets a brief mention in the book.
but
And I
not
think,
in the actual
yeah,
film.
but I mean, there you go, right? Like, so I kind of almost think that that's given me a sort of leg up, right? Like being from a place, like if I would have grown up in LA and I was going and seeing all the best bands at the Olympic Auditorium every fucking weekend and shit, like would I have just become jaded faster? Would I have become, would I be, I don't know. Would I take any of this for granted? And it wasn't like when I was 14, 15, 16 in Florida going to shows, I was like, I wasn't thinking like, oh man, like I have to put in all this work just to get this fucking Christian death record, and or see this fucking band. Like, this is really gonna build my character down the road. You just don't think like that. And I think for the most part, I would hear about things going on in LA and New York, and I'd be like, oh, fuck, fuck. And then I'd be like, oh, fuck those kids, you know, like, fuck those shitty kids. They have it so easy. But I like that in retrospect, as I look back over my life, I like that I got to be, that I, that I got to, it's also like the big fish in a small pond thing, right? Like I was able to be part of a punk scene where I feel like if I grew up in LA or something, I'd be this, one of a million fucking ugly kids, with a shitty haircut,
And just speaking of that and thinking about the F Boyz again for a moment. Would you ever consider doing a reunion with the F Boyz?
Well, I mean, no, because Matty, who was the guitar player and I was in Hickey with, he passed away in 2002. And his brother Scott, who was our bass player, is an attorney now. I'm still in touch with everybody that was, in this band and a lot of the people I grew up with playing in these bands. But and Seaweed, our singer, recently just moved to Hawaii. He lived out here in Vacaville, about 2 hours north, and we were on the phone a lot and met up for lunch a couple of times and whatnot. So, everybody's and also it was like one of the reasons we started Hickey after the Fuckboyz is because we were so like embarrassed and mortified by the name and we wanted to like grow into something. We were 20, we were in our early 20s and we're like, oh man, I'm in a band called the Fuckboyz, which I think we only named it the Fuckboyz because we knew it would kind of bum out our parents a little bit. It was Seaweed's dad who was this guy George, who was this great like redneck dude with a pompadour, and we were struggling to come up with the band name. And George was a highly funny, quotable dude, and I think I was just fucking with him, and I was like, "Hey George, what should we call our band?" And he was like, "Y'all should call it Fuck Boys, because that's what y'all are." And I went, I went to see what knows like George might be on to something. Now the name has this whole other thing, right? Like it's this term like the young people use, but it didn't have a meaning back then.
Right.
It was just two words that sounded funny together. And then
Whose idea was it for the Z instead of an S at the end?
I don't know. I remember that there was a couple of things that worked. There was a band from South Florida. Again, I'm gonna upset somebody. They were called Z Toys, and they had a Z, and we thought that looked kind of cool, but also kind of dumb. Like it was sort of a nod to like hair metal, which we thought was funny. And fuck South Florida, I think second only to LA had like a really huge hair metal scene and in like the mid and late 80s. And ironically enough, like, when I was the year I wasn't in the band, the Fuckboyz ended up playing a lot of shows with like hair metal bands that like and became friends with a lot of those dudes because, I think the Z confused them, and they weren't really, we weren't punk enough to be, we weren't a hardcore band and also it was like what the fuck were we doing? So we played shows with like hair metal bands like fucking Romeo Cowboy and Lick City and Rated X. And like, why the fuck do I know the names of these bands? Because we played with them. Romeo Cowboy was cool though. Shit, so was Lick City.
You mentioned earlier about your memory wasn't always the best, but you got a good memory for remembering some of those bands.
Yeah, I do. It's weird. It's like I always think especially like working at the record store, it's like my coworkers are all much younger than me, and I'll fucking just be spouting forth some facts about like some fucking Deep Purple record or something, and they're like, oh well, how do you know all this shit? And then I always think it's like probably because I don't know how to like drive a car or have like meaningful, like long lasting relationships with, like what are the things I don't know because I know about Lick City and Romeo Cowboy and Tricks, two X's.
There you go. A lot of X's. Do the people in your circle now, especially at the record store, do they know about your early history in Florida and what you contributed to the scene down there?
Uh, by and large, no. And I would argue that I didn't contribute that much to the scene down there, other than being a kid going to shows and playing in some bands. Like that was the extent of it. Later in the 90s, when I was in my 20s out here with Hickey, like, yeah, I felt like we contributed a lot to the scene and we sort of built a DIY scene in San Francisco that didn't exist. But no, I mean, I kind of like for a lot of one of the things I love about working in the record store is sort of my anonymity around it, and I mean, I was in this band Agalloch that was pretty well known, in the metal scene, and sold a lot of fucking records and, has a huge, huge following still. Um, so if I get like recognized or anybody wants to like discuss with me like the musical output or whatever, it's usually about that band, or bands I played in here locally that people liked. But I don't know that a whole lot of people out here know I'm from Florida. And when I meet people from Florida, it's like, yeah, we got lots to talk about.
Well, the secret's out.
The
So
secret's out. Good.
it is
That's
out. And you know what's interesting too, Aesop, is there have been a lot of people over the years since I've been doing the podcast who have name dropped you, just whether it be on an episode or just in conversation about you should get Aesop Dekker on the podcast.
oh
Get
wow.
Aesop Dekker on the podcast. And then you mentioned you feel like your contributions may not have been significant to you, but I think to others who were around you or knew of you or knew what you were about, they may have felt otherwise. And I think that's a huge a compliment to yourself for whatever you were doing back then. It impacted people in a positive way.
Well, that's nice to hear. Yeah, and I do know that like there have been things that I have been a part of. I wouldn't take credit for them, but things that I was a piece of, in the machination that were highly, influential and pointed a lot of people in directions and whatnot. But I just don't know that how much of it. My time in Florida between like when I started playing in bands and when I moved was really only like 4 years, maybe five. So it's a blip in my life.
That's a lot of time in punk years, my friend.
It really is, yeah, and like when I look back on it, like, the thing that I value the most about my time in Florida was getting to see a bunch of really cool shows. Had nothing to do with like, my participation. And I was definitely never like in any of the bands I've been in, I've never been like the guy, like the guy that's like I'm not a songwriter. I'm not like, it's just I've just been a drummer. I've been really fortunate that like somehow with very minimal effort, on my part, I got pretty good at it, and there's also like not a whole lot of drummers in the world. Everybody plays guitar. So I've been asked to be in a lot of really cool bands, and that's put me in a situation where I got to play with a lot of amazing musicians who were better than me, and I learned from them and kept growing. And every time I would do this thing, like sit down behind a drum set, almost I have to deal with this little bit of imposter syndrome, where it's like I'm not a fucking technically proficient drummer. I never took a lesson. There's a million people that do this better than me, but I've still been fortunate enough to like get to do pretty much everything I want to do, go everywhere I wanted to go with very little, you know, like I said, effort. It does, like, from looking back, I'm not a diligently hardworking man. I'm categorically fucking lazy, and I've still gotten to do all this cool shit, and I think probably only because, um, you know, luck. I don't know if I believe in luck, but some of it is luck and some of it is having this idea that just um going with the flow, I guess, see where this takes me, being willing to say yes to things and then later regretting it.
I think
Right.
also passion plays a part into it too, because you've come across very passionate about the music and the culture and the scene and the history of it. And I think that all has a big impact on maybe why too, but that's just my opinion.
Yeah, and I think for a lot of people, like just being in love with music and still like that's never fucking changed. Like everything else has changed, but that's always remained. And I've always had this weird thing, I think, since I discovered punk and like especially like listening to the Off the Beaten Path, to get back to that, was like when I would hear that there was like that this guy, there was enough punk out in the world that this guy could fill a 2 hour show like every week, it made me aware that like, oh, this is bigger than I understand and that I can see from my vantage point. So that kind of early on produced this weird idea that there's so much shit out there that I have yet to hear. And it could be amazing. It could be life-changing. Now, I've heard a lot of it now, and it happens less frequently, but it still fucking happens. I still get completely fucking blown away or moved by a record that maybe came out a week ago, maybe came out 50 years ago and I missed it. So that's always stayed with me, is this idea that there's still things out there that are good and worth hearing. So that's kept my ears open, I guess, and I think that's probably helped out a lot. And then continuing to listen to things in this way where it's like, what can I learn from this? I'm still hearing that's an interesting phrase, wow, that's a strange sound, and that stayed with me. Everything else has changed. Like, my balls got longer and I get a little more winded walking up the stairs and all the things that happen, but that's remained the red thread through my whole fucking life.
Sure.
Yeah.
Well, I agree with you. And when it comes down to the things continuing to grow and evolve and change, and keep checking out new music and staying connected to that, and also thinking about what still keeps you moving and motivated. And I know you did mention that you could feel lazy, and that's kind of, but also too, you put in work. I mean, you've been in a lot of bands and you've worked hard, and I imagine a lot of touring. Outside of what you did in your contributions in Florida, you've been very productive in that sense in your career, and I think that's a testament to who you are. I think that's fantastic, and why people still love many of the bands that you've been in over the years. So it's not a bad
I mean,
thing.
I appreciate that, but I always feel like when you say, you worked hard, I'm always just stricken with the thought others worked harder, and I got in on it, and I was happy, more than happy to benefit from the hard work of others. I mean, there's the whole like I definitely paid dues and slept in a lot of like dog shit covered floors and spent some time in fucking jail cells and eaten lots and lots of top ramen and done all these things, just to do this,
Sure.
right? But I didn't have a frame of reference. Like anything else didn't seem available to me, like, or afforded to me. I mean, like I said, I went to school, but I went to art school. I didn't come out of it with like, a degree in banking or anything. It was more going to school to learn how to do much of the same shit.
And that shows dedication as well, I think, too, because you're putting in that time and that effort to commit yourself to something. No matter what you came out with degree wise, I feel like you are still spending that time
Yeah.
committing to something. And
I mean, for me, it was more like a familial pressure to like go to school, and to have, my family were they value they come from that generation, and it's like Jewish valuing academics and you have to go to college. And I went, because art school was the one thing that was like, oh, well, I could see myself doing that, that's like school, but not really school. And I didn't even stick it out because I was so like I went to the San Francisco Art Institute, and like what I immediately was stricken by was that it wasn't a place where it was a place where I was going to be inspired by other people that went there, but not by the staff. And it was not a place where I was going to learn any technical skills. It was a place where I was going to learn how to sell art, and convince people that, the art I did had merit. And I didn't like that. It kind of framed art as this commodity, and I couldn't stand it. So I left. And I was like, wait a minute, like by these definitions, I'm in a band that makes art. Like I'm a fucking artist. Like why the fuck am I wasting time going to school to become an artist? I'm already an artist. And the real tipping point for that for me was there was a guy in one of the classes I had, this guy who was a performance artist from New York, and one of his performance projects was he had started a punk band, and he was talking about this punk band like it was this high art. He had assembled the right people and studied in the aesthetic. And I was fucking 18 or 19 at the time, and I'm listening to this and I'm like, how fucking dare this guy? How dare this guy take this thing that is ultimately sacred? I probably didn't think of it in these terms, but is fucking important to me, and frame it as some high art bullshit, like this thing that I've been doing already at that point for 4 fucking years. This guy's been doing it for a year and he's telling me about it, you know? I ended up getting into an argument with him. You know, there was a Q&A afterwards and I said, hey, I played in band since I was 14 years old. How is what I do different than what you do? And he couldn't explain it in a way that didn't make me throw up in my mouth, you know? So I had that to me was the beginning of the end where I was just like, oh, I don't like this world either. You know, this isn't, it's not the square button down banker world, but this isn't my world either. Like, I don't, and that kind of pushed me into this weird sort of militism, you know, militarism around, you know, my art, you know, where my art is not art, man. My art is this blue collar, everybody gets a turn in the sandbox kind of thing, you know, like fuck that. And it, so I left school and yeah, just pursued playing music. You know, I still paint, I still draw, but you know, it's not what I do. It's not what I'm known for, you know.
Right. Right. Interesting story though, and how that kind of, that situation came about, and but you definitely
Yeah.
challenged that, which is good. And
I wish I remember the guy's name or the band's name because I would probably like relentlessly stalk him right now and just be like, you piece of shit, you know, just hold that fucking grudge. But but you know, it was a really profound moment in
sure.
my life as a creative, right? That just is like, you fuck, man, like, you know, it's like the same shit. Like if I was to one day be like, hey, I want to try my hand at boxing, right? But I'm not going to do, you know, I'm not really a boxer. I'm an artist that's, you know, saying something about boxing. Like, I deserve to get my fucking ass kicked. Like, every person that has poured their life into boxing should fucking punch me square in the dick at that fucking moment because it's fucking pretentious and it's insulting, you know? It's really, and it cheapens this. I'd hate to like say punk is was my craft, you know, but it cheapens my fucking craft, and I responded viscerally to it, you know.
I can sense that. I can feel
Yeah,
it.
I'm getting worked up, man. I'm like ready to
Yeah,
fucking
yeah,
throw some hands, man.
you are ready. So, but it's been great chatting with you
Yeah,
and
thanks so much. Super
getting,
fun.
yeah, getting a chance to walk back through time and through your Florida years and listen to some of the stories that you shared and some of the different shows that you went to go see and some of the venues that are long gone but still remembered because they were so impactful to not just yourself, of course, but to all the people who were going to those shows back then and get a chance to hear and relive some of those memories through guests like yourself. So thanks so much, Aesop, for coming on the podcast.
Yeah,
Really,
thank you.
really appreciate it. So as we get ready to close things out, I would love to give you the last word. Any final thoughts or comments you'd like to share with folks out there? The floor is yours.
Yeah, man. I guess the overarching theme I think is you know, don't stay too long where you grow up, you know, see as much of the world as you can and you know, follow uh don't follow trends. This is all seems very trite and cliche, but it's all shit that's worked for me. Don't take yourself too seriously. Don't take things personally. It's never about us. We're not the main character. You know, just let it go and have fun and do your thing and don't worry about what others think. And these things for me are the recipe for a good life and as much happiness as you can possibly wrench out of a world that really will work against you and work against happiness a lot. So that's it. And just really thanks. And fucking Viva Florida, man, the flaccid wang shaped state that fucking produced a lot of really, really great stuff. Like not just serial killers and fucking space shuttle disasters or Anna Nicole Smith dying or like whatever the fuck you associate it with, man. There's things going on there that have value. And it's a beautifully fucked up weird place. So respect.